Welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Lewin. As you know, if you've been reading the Texas Energy and Power newsletter or listening to the podcast, the Texas legislative session has just ended. There was a ton of energy news, more than any one person can keep up with. I was trying to keep up with it, but somebody that I think kept up with it even better than I did was Claire Hao, a reporter at the Houston Chronicle covering the Texas power grid, the clean energy transition, and other electricity-related topics. There's nobody better to have on the pod than Claire to go over what just happened. We had a great discussion, covered a ton of different topics, including just about all of those that she covered at the Houston Chronicle over the session. Various utility regulation, of course, the anti-energy bills that I've written a lot about here, got into the nuclear bill, the large load bill, all of that. Claire, before she started at the Houston Chronicle, spent a year on the climate environment team in the San Francisco Chronicle. She's also been on the news desks of Bloomberg Law and the Chicago Tribune, as well as the editorial board of the Washington Post. She graduated from the University of Michigan. And like I said, she's just done a phenomenal job over the last 2 years covering the energy beat, particularly the ERCOT grid beat at the Houston Chronicle, including tremendous coverage during Hurricane Beryl outage in the Houston area that lasted for several 100,000 people for more than a week. She and her colleague Nina Satija did an unbelievable job covering the use or non-use, as it was, of the mobile generators and has followed that story all the way through. She and the team at the Houston Chronicle do a great job, and I really appreciate her taking time to talk through all that she covered and even to ask me a few questions about what I saw happening at the legislature. Just a quick note before we jump into this. This is a paid episode, so there's going to be 20, 25 minutes, something like that, that's free to everybody, and then it jumps over to being a paid episode. If you're a paid subscriber and want to listen to the full episode in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can set that up right from your Substack account. Just log into your account and connect your private feed to your favorite app. We have included a link with instruction in the Substack post and the email for this episode, so it should be easy to find. I've gotten a bunch of questions from people about this. You can listen to the paid episode on the Substack app, but again, you can listen to it wherever you listen to your podcast. You just have to link your Substack account to it. And one last note before we jump into the episode. Obviously, the Texas legislative session is just wrapped up, but there is still a ton going on. There's a Public Utility Commission meeting this week. There's an ERCOT board meeting later this month. The Independent Market Monitor State of the Market report just came out. There's a comment period on distributed energy resources. The federal budget bill impacts Texas in major ways. We're going to cover all that and much more here at the newsletter. So if you're not yet a paid subscriber, please become one. Please share this podcast and the newsletter with friends, families, and colleagues. Word of mouth is the best way for us to grow our audience, and we really appreciate your support. And with that, let's jump into the episode with Claire Hao. Thanks for listening. Claire Hao, welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Love reading your stuff at the Houston Chronicle. You're doing amazing work covering the energy industry with a particular focus on the power grid. We're recording on June 2nd. We're going to try to turn this one around quickly because the legislative session is just ending in the next few hours as we're talking. What are your biggest takeaways from the legislature, either things that did pass or didn't pass? What's kind of the headline item in your mind?
Yeah, well, thank you for reading, and thanks for always picking up my calls. In terms of headline items, I already seen a couple of headlines out about the quiet death of the bills that would have limited renewable energy here in Texas. I wanted to wait until today, just in case they found a way to attach themselves to larger bills, but that doesn't look like it's likely to move forward. So the renewable energy industry, safe for now. We'll still look to Capitol Hill for what's going on there, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But I think that is obviously big news given just how much renewable growth we have here in Texas. Other headline items, SB 6, the big bill to protect the power grid as we see unprecedented load growth coming to Texas, especially from data centers and other large industrial users. HB 14, that's the bill that would create a fund for nuclear energy in the state. I think right now it's limited to $350 million. That's correct, right, Doug?
That's right.
Down from $2 billion, which was the initial goal, and then it went to $750 million, and then it went to $350 million. Still a hefty sum for a grant to help nuclear energy construction, pre-construction activities, and then construction. So 2 separate buckets of funds. I think those are the main 3 things that I was watching that was coming out of it. A lot of the other bills I was looking at either fit within those 3 buckets or died somewhere along the way. Would you say those are your 3 main items or anything else you want to add?
I think those 3 are definitely on the short list. I think the other one that I was kinda keeping an eye on throughout the session, Claire, was the Texas Energy Fund and what they did with that, whether or not it got, because the House originally had $2 billion in their budget and the Senate had 5 in there. And as readers of the newsletter and listeners of the podcast will know, there's $1.8 billion for what are called backup power packages for distributed energy resources at critical facilities. You had amazing coverage last summer of the outages after Hurricane Beryl, and even the outages. I believe you wrote about the outages that just happened last week, right? Weren't there more outages last week? So,
Yes.
like, having backup generation at these facilities could make a really big difference, and now my understanding is that funding is there, so there's actually $1.8 billion for this. So I'd probably add that to the list.
That's a good point. I know at some point during the session, the budget had only set aside $2 billion for the Texas Energy Fund, which wouldn't have been able to cover all of the programs. And I was curious to see how they would allocate that and if any at all would be set aside for both the outside of ERCOT grid improvements and the backup power promise. So now there's going to be a lot less fighting for that money.
Yeah, so let's start with the bills that were really sort of targeted at the renewable energy industry. I believe you wrote about all of them: 388, 819, which was the permitting bill, and then 715 and 3356, which were the so-called firming bills. You talked to a lot of people during session, obviously did extensive reporting on this. What was your kind of like what was motivating this, and what were some of like the themes you heard from folks, not just in the renewable energy industry, but in industry more broadly, as you talk to folks about what the impacts would have been and what it means that those bills aren't going forward? And, kind of what it means, not only, I think, looking at a couple different things, both kind of economically, what it means for the economy, but then also politically. Like, what does it mean that these bills didn't go forward?
Yeah, well, maybe first to start with what motivated some of these bills, or at least the stated motivations of their authors and the groups that supported them. There was this common sentiment, from 388 to 819, that there were too many renewable energy resources on the grid. And, of course, with the framing bills as well, this idea that too many renewable energy resources made the power grid unreliable. And for example, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, the group that was especially supporting the firming bills, SB 715 and HB 3356, this argument that renewable energy was adding hidden costs to everybody's electricity bills because they required natural gas plants or coal plants to ramp up and down more, to turn off and turn on when solar or wind wasn't available, so that this added hidden cost to everybody's electricity bill because that was inefficient, but we needed that. So, for example, 388 would have required a one-to-one build essentially of gas and renewables going forward to balance out, those traits of renewables that critics says it has: unreliable, expensive. 819 would have added all of these new permitting requirements only for renewable energy, really far setback requirements, a whole hearing process. That was the idea that, renewable energy was just proliferating across Texas unchecked and it needed some checks. And then, of course, all of these bills passed in the Senate, but ultimately died in the House. So they're effectively dead for now, or dead, I guess, officially for now, by the time that listeners are listening to this. And so now to your second question of what I heard in response, why these bills were a bad idea, not only from the renewable energy industry, but from industry more broadly. One, there are such constraints on gas build out right now. It's very difficult to get a gas turbine. I mean, everybody has been writing and talking about this. And you said this many times throughout session. If we're going to tie our renewable energy build out to our gas build out, we're going to limit the amount of energy supply that we have in the state at a time when energy demand is growing faster than ever. So if we do that, we're going to limit the ability of the state to grow and accept all of these data centers, to be on the front lines of AI, as a lot of state leaders said they want to be. That was the whole point of SB 6. And then also that if we do succeed in limiting renewable energy, that could make the grid more reliable, less supply, more demand. The whole job of ERCOT is to keep those two in balance. The ERCOT CEO himself, he told a bunch of reporters in Austin that characterizing renewables as the problem is not accurate and it's not helpful to the conversation. And he has been a proponent of bringing more gas to ERCOT, but he said that the best way to do that would be to incentivize and continue the growth of all sources of generation. So we definitely heard all of the above energy multiple times over and over again. I heard a new term this session, all of the above and below energy.
Geothermal.
Yes. And then also the argument too that we're hearing now with the Inflation Reduction Act negotiations, that if we are to limit renewable energy, we're also taking a source of low cost energy off the grid, which would send electricity bills skyrocketing as a result. So now that these bills haven't passed, I think to your last question, Texas remains open for business to the renewable energy industry still as of now. I also heard repeatedly that the reason Texas has become the leader in renewable energy is because it's so much easier to build here. It's just easy. It's easy to build housing. It's easy to build energy. And so Texas remains that kind of place for renewable energy. And so I think we'll continue to see really fast growth of solar, really fast growth of storage. We'll see with HB 14 and with some of the other bills that passed on geothermal, also Texas remaining a leader in those energy resources as well.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about the nuclear bill, but before we go there, I'm just curious, like, were you kind of surprised at the broad kind of agreement that seems to be out there? I mean, you mentioned ERCOT CEO Pablo Vegas, but we saw at different points during the session the Texas Association of Business, the manufacturers, the oil and gas industry, chemical producers, industrial customers, energy buyers, data centers, like all kind of expressing this, like, hey, these bills would really hurt us. Did you kind of expect that coming into session, or were you kind of surprised at how broad-based the opposition? I can't think of another word for it. Maybe you can help me out with
Yeah.
another word, but were you surprised how broad-based that was?
Not particularly. I mean,
Okay.
something
Yeah.
that I've come to appreciate reporting on energy in Texas is also that everything that has to do with energy here is driven, well, not everything, but largely driven by markets. And so the reason, Texoga, the
Yep.
Texas Oil and Gas Association, the Texas Association of Manufacturers, they didn't necessarily, they stayed quiet on SB 388 and on SB 819, at least to my knowledge. But the bills that they did tell me or other reporters that they had concerns about were SB 715 and HB 3056. The reason was because that would totally overwrite their existing power purchase agreements and it would send their own costs higher. And so I think like the fact that there is this broad base of concern, criticism, opposition, whatever you want to call it. I mean, renewable energy has just entrenched itself so greatly into the Texas economy at this point. All large energy users depend on it to some degree. And you talked about this a lot too, how maybe, casual observers or folks that aren't super connected to industry, they may not realize that oil and gas operators now really do use a lot of renewable energy for their operations. So when you try to take away, again, this low cost energy resource, I think naturally you are going to have a broad base of people who also data centers, use a ton of energy that are going to come and speak out, not necessarily because they care about climate change or they like the renewable energy industry, but they certainly buy it.
Yeah, they buy it and they buy it because it's cheaper, and that is one of the things that was, like, sort of most remarkable to me about some of the claims that renewables are driving prices higher, and it's like, well, if they're driving prices higher, why are people buying? If it's more expensive, like, why are people buying it? How did you find the different sort of claims that were made there? I know you dig into details on this stuff. Like, what do you see in the different research about costs renewables are adding or costs that they're reducing?
Well, I think the argument for renewables adding costs, if you dig into, for example, the Texas Public Policy Foundation paper from February of this year, and this is something that their energy policy lead had told me, is the added or the hidden cost of renewable energy is not in the cost of renewable energy production. It's in the cost of all other sources of energy production. I'm paraphrasing the quote there, but he pretty much said that to me directly. And so their argument there is that folks who often point to renewable energy and say, actually, it's cheap, it's low cost, it reduces electricity bills, they point often to the levelized cost of electricity. And you look at renewable energy and it's so much lower. Wind and solar don't have fuel costs. They have fairly low ongoing operation and maintenance costs. But again, their argument is that these resources need other resources to back them up when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And so the act of having to ramp up and down those gas plants or having to ramp up and down the coal plants, using coal plants and gas plants that way is more inefficient, and that adds cost. I mean, in counteracting that criticism from you and other folks is that thinking of resources individually based on whether they're unreliable or not is sort of like you can find an Achilles heel to every single resource. You can then point to natural gas and coal power plants and say that they have high failure rates during the heat, especially, summer of 2023, we saw that a lot, or that they're vulnerable to fuel shortages. We saw that during Winter Storm Uri, and that pointing at each resource and finding its weak point, playing this sort of blame game is not necessarily helpful. The best way to run a system is to acknowledge the strengths and weaknesses of each resource and then to operate them as a system accordingly. So I'm curious, though, as to your thoughts as well, just what you think of that sort of argument. It's one that we hear repeatedly over and over again. After the Spain blackouts, we certainly heard this argument that renewable energy is unreliable. After the MISO rotating outages, that argument didn't seem to appear. It's one that we also hear on the national stage. At CERAWeek, Energy Secretary Chris Wright repeatedly said that wind energy was driving up electricity costs. How do you parse through those arguments?
Yeah, I think you said it very well in the sense that, and this is, I've been quoting a lot the deputy executive director of the PUC that said, we back up the system based on risks, not on resource type. And those risks go across different resource types, right? But you don't have each resource type provide its own backup. You referenced MISO in Louisiana, like they have something like 3% of their system is wind and solar, and they had rotating outages. The full report isn't out on that, but at least the initial appearance is that it was a lot of thermal plant outages that caused them to have rotating outages. Of course, TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, during Winter Storm Elliott, again, 3% wind and solar, they had rolling outages. Texas had rolling outages in 2011 and 2006. 2011, there was a fair bit of wind on the system, but still far, far lower than anything like we see now and no solar to speak of. 2006, there was hardly any, and it was in the springtime. So, like, to suggest that like wind and solar are causing all these problems and require all this backup that other resources don't, I just think is a specious argument. And I don't think that the data actually bears it out. And again, you can actually see this in the reports. I still find it, Claire, just amazing that during the last session, TPPF and others pushed for the PUC to do a study to tell us what the costs of renewable energy, like adding to the, how much extra cost is there from renewables in the form of ancillary services. And the report came back with there's no clear connection between those things. And we see ancillary service costs just sort of rising with the cost of the system. And it was when he was talking about that report that the PUC Deputy Executive Director Bart Zell-English said, we don't back up based on resource type, the risk to the system. And meanwhile, like, even though that study had that finding, they didn't try to take the firming that's already in statute out. They tried to like move it up. And yeah, no, obviously I don't find those arguments particularly compelling, and more to the point, they aren't useful. The kinds of things that they're pushing towards, I think would just make the grid more expensive and potentially even lower reliability. I guess the other piece of this, and again, you've covered this in your writing, like the amount of quote unquote firming that we're getting on the system right now is extraordinary. Like we had 200 megawatts of storage at the time of Winter Storm Uri. We're over 11,000 megawatts of energy storage, a 55x increase in 4 years. Like the market is actually delivering those outcomes. And that's why I think a lot of the business community was speaking up on these, particularly on that Senate Bill 715, which I think spooked everybody because it actually did make it through a House committee. And that was different than past years. So I think it got a lot more real to a lot of folks.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, the fact that it made it through a House committee. I believe some of the other bills that the renewable energy industry was scared of also made it through a House committee. I think the bill that would have banned offshore wind turbines from connecting to the ERCOT grid through state waters, that one also made it through a House committee. And I haven't been around for other Texas legislative sessions. This is my first one. So wanted to ask a little bit about how this session perhaps compared to past sessions, because something I think about as a reporter too, in terms of how to frame these bills, is that none of these are new ideas. They were either refiles from last sessions or tweaks to concepts from last session and the session in 2021. Both in 2021 and 2023, these bills didn't pass. That's why they were proposed again this year. They didn't pass again. So, how do people outside of Texas make sense of what's happening in Texas when these bills continuously are proposed but don't pass? And then for reporters, like at what point are we crying wolf about the fact that Texas might be ending its renewable energy boom, or is there continuing to be a real threat to the industry session after session from these bills?
Yeah, great questions, and I'm excited to answer it. I'm going to ask you about SB6 and HB14 in a minute because I want to get more of your perspective on some of these things too. But let's talk about that. So, first of all, that is different to my knowledge. I don't think any of those proposals, I could be wrong. I'd have to go back and check, and people will certainly correct me if I get this wrong, but I don't think any of them actually made it through House committee. Now, one of the biggest differences this time, Claire, was that there wasn't the one like huge bill, right? To the extent that there was a big electricity bill out there, it was SB6, which we'll talk about in a minute, the large load bill. But if you go back to 2021, right, the context was Winter Storm Uri happened during the legislative session, right? For those not super steeped in Texas, right, 140 days every 2 years, and Winter Storm Uri was, like, roughly the 30th day of the session. So, of course, they were gonna deal with that, and Senate Bill 3 was the outcome, a huge bill. And then in 2023, in Texas, we have this process called the sunset process, where every agency every 12 years undergoes a review and must be continued in statute. Otherwise, it sunsets, it ceases to exist. And in the interim, there's like a top to bottom review. So it was supposed to be the review was like 2024 and in 2025 would have been the session. But because of Winter Storm Uri, they moved that up. So they had their full sunset review in 2022. And then that bill, House Bill 1500, was the big bill that session. Those bills are often referred to in legislative discussions as Christmas tree bills, so called because you can hang anything on them, right? There wasn't that kind of bill this time. So while some of the bills did very narrowly on 8 to 7 votes, and we'll talk about that in a minute, passed the committee. Senate Bill 383 did that, and 3356, that was the offshore wind ban, and the quote unquote firming bill made it through 8 to 7. You didn't then have this other place where all of those different proposals could go. That was a very big difference, the final weekend of this session versus 2021 and 2022. As far as the crying wolf thing goes, it's not crying wolf. Like these are very, very real proposals that anytime a proposal passes one chamber, that is obviously a big deal. I mean, even if it just passed a Senate committee and not passed the Senate chamber, that's still a big deal. And if anybody thinks that it's, crying wolf or that like, oh, this happens every 2 years in Texas, don't worry about it. That is not true. These proposals are serious as a heart attack. And again, we're, at various points very seriously close to passing again, with a couple of them actually passing House committee. And as far as that House committee goes, 8 to 7 vote, really fascinating vote where you had two rural Republicans, Chairman Drew Darby, Chairman Smithy, both with very large West Texas districts with a whole lot of renewable development in them, which means a lot of tax base, right? A lot of roads being paid for with renewables and schools and hospital districts. Oil and gas too, right? I don't know as much about Smithy's district. His may not have as much oil and gas, but I actually interviewed Chairman Darby for the podcast. I'm more familiar with his district. He's got oil and gas. That's an all of the above and below district, right? He's probably, I don't know if they have a geothermal resource out there, but definitely he's got oil and gas and wind and solar. So they both voted against it. Richard Raymond, a Democrat, actually voted for both of those. And but for his vote, both of those would have failed. So very rare you see those kinds of votes in a committee. You tend to see sort of party line votes, and this cuts across that, which I found to be particularly interesting. So did I leave any part of your question unanswered? Because I want to ask you about SB6 and the large load bill, but certainly don't want to cut off that conversation.
I think the one question that I do have remaining is how do people outside of Texas, whether they be big companies or smaller independent developers, as they look at Texas? The bills didn't pass. So, like I said earlier, Texas remains open for business, but they might be thinking, what about 2 years later or 4 years later or 6 years later? What would you say to folks about how they should understand Texas going forward, given that every 2 years we have these proposals coming through?
Yeah, I would encourage anybody to get involved, right? If they're not already, get involved in the ERCOT stakeholder process, join the various associations and organizations that are working on these issues, because the only way that Texas will remain a place that is open for business and have the robust economic growth that is enabled by the growth of energy production, including renewable energy, is to have a lot of participation and a lot of people speaking up. So if anybody's just sort of sitting on the sidelines as an observer, as a spectator, I would just encourage folks to get involved, because the more folks that are involved, the more voices that are there, the better sort of information folks have and better possibility. Because look, I think right now, and I've talked about this a little bit, but I don't think we can talk about it too much. We're alive in a very, very strange time, right? I mean, like the information environment and the information ecosystem. I wish everybody was getting their information from the Houston Chronicle, Claire, but we have to understand that most people aren't, right? They're getting their information from Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or TikTok or whatever. And those algorithms are YouTube, right? Those algorithms are feeding them. If you slow down on a story about how renewables are raising costs or cratering grid reliability, you're going to get fed 10 more things like that. And so the misinformation that is out there is really rampant. It's fueled by some bad actors and then by algorithms that are really keying in to what you're after. So I do think it's very important that people get more involved. And I would just say, I think any state is subject to legislative whims, right? There's that famous quote that like whatever legislatures in session, nobody's life, liberty, or property is safe, right? I mean, that's not unique to Texas. That was a quote that I think came from a 19th century New York legislator. I think it was a judge actually in 19th century New York. So, those kinds of problems are as old as democracy itself, and you're never going to have full regulatory certainty. But I honestly think more than most places, Texas kind of, and I hope it stays this way, has this ethos of like, you can build here, like this is a place you can build stuff, which may be a really good segue into talking about Senate Bill 6. I think you followed that bill more than I did. I followed it a lot, but I know you've been following it very closely. Like, what do you think is kind of the outcome of that bill? Is Texas a place that data center developers, as one example, but other large loads too, that, Texas remains a place they're going to want to come to? Or do you think that there's sort of some significant braking mechanism in there that might actually slow down some of the large load growth we've been seeing in Texas?
Thank you for listening to this free preview of the Energy Capital podcast. You can access the entire episode as well as the Texas Energy and Power newsletter archives at douglewin.com. That's DOUGLEWIN.com. You'll also be able to attend paid subscriber-only chats, and you'll receive full access to all of the Texas Grid roundups and reading and podcast picks. Please check it out, and thank you for listening.